right, so we are going to move it right along, and we are talking about AI, as I mentioned yesterday, and we've got a double header. I think Josh might kick us off, and then Tim will also speak to it as well. So let's talk about how engineering leaders can extract value in the next year with AI. Come on up, Josh.
All right, so like Amy said, I'm going to go through AI and knowledge aware from an Auros IQ perspective. And once we get through that, Tim's going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges and risks associated with just AI in general. Okay, so first, just the definition of generative AI. It's essentially, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's essentially something that uses artificial intelligence to generate responses, right? Those responses could be text, they could be images. It depends on what the data set that it's looking at to return those responses is. It's going to identify patterns within that data set. So the training data is the data set that it's accessing. It's going to identify those patterns and then generate new data with similar characteristics to the patterns that exist in the data set that's provided. So what that means from an engineering tool perspective is that there's a couple different use cases where we see generative AI being integrated into various engineering tools, not just Auros IQ, but a lot of different tools I would assume are going to start integrating generative AI into their functionality. The first aspect of this, there's two examples that we'll talk about. They're very similar. The interaction model is going to be very similar. The results are going to be similar in nature. The difference is going to be the data set that they use to harvest and then produce the response. So the first one, you may have heard of copilots. Copilots are being integrated into a lot of different products. Essentially, they are taking information provided from the software provider, right? And they're using those to provide in-app direct assistance. So things like going into Auros IQ, typing in a question of, how should I configure my community? It's going to go off. The generative AI will then harvest information from a data set that was provided by Auros Knowledge Systems, and it'll return a response. So the first fundamental use case is the copilot concept. The second one is summarizing domain-specific information. So it's very similar to what we just talked about. The difference is mainly going to be that the data set used is provided by the customer. So your knowledge packets, your issues, the information that you put into assessments. You can use these natural language prompts, allow people to put questions in, and then it can harvest the information from those other data sources that are provided by the software users to go out, find information, and then provide responses back. So those are the two general ways that we kind of see things working right now. Obviously, those can and most likely will evolve, but we'll talk a little bit about what those two use cases mean for Auros IQ in particular. You're going to hear a little bit more about this when Michaela Sprague goes through the features that are coming, or at least are planned to be coming in Auros IQ. But for right now, we'll talk a little bit about, I jumped ahead of myself. Right now, we're going to talk a little bit about the actual technology. So there's two options for the technology. The first one, everyone I'm sure is familiar with, ChatGPT. For IP reasons, the way that ChatGPT would work is we take the information that we have, we send it off to a third-party data processor, which is ChatGPT. They process the data, and then they send the responses back. For IP reasons, obviously that's a problem, right? Because we have intellectual property. We don't want to send that to a third-party data processor, have them process and then own all that information, and then send responses back. So that's something that we can't actually incorporate into the Auros product as is right now. But Llama 2, which is another large language model, is something that we are able to take. We can put it on our own servers. We can run Llama 2 on our own instances. And it eliminates the need for that third party to process the data and send the responses back. So Llama 2 is the functionality that we're currently going through different research and development activities with. The first thing, the Auros IQ Copilot. So we've done some different experiments using a lot of the help content that we have, the help communities, some of the resources that we have, whether they be in PowerPoints or PDFs, And we've been doing some experiments to ask different questions. The responses are coming back fairly positively, say 75% accuracy at this certain point in time. So as we refine the data, as we refine the user experience, that I would assume is going to improve. And then the second use case, or the second thing that we're going through R&D experiments for right now, is this NLP interface. So being able to say, have we had a problem with this particular part in the past? Do we have a best practice associated with this particular concept? That is, the interaction model would be the same, right? If you're asking a question about configuration, you're asking a question about whatever your domain is, and the response would be the same. Obviously, the data set that's being used would be different. So with all that being said, the space obviously is evolving rapidly. I think if we took a poll of individuals that have heard of generative AI or have heard of ChatGPT a year ago, we probably wouldn't have any hands up in the entire room. If we took that poll today, I assume everybody has heard of it, right? So it's very rapid, the advancements that are being made, and there's going to be new opportunities, I'm sure, that arise, and we'll be interested in looking into those and seeing how they can potentially improve the product as well. So a couple conclusions real quick, or a few conclusions, I suppose. Generative AI is going to impact engineering efficiencies, both long and short term. I think it's pretty obvious that that's going to happen, at least we believe that it will. What those impacts are going to look like, how they'll evolve, we don't know, but we're excited to find out. The second thing, obviously, we're working on the use cases that I just referred to. I'm working with Llama 2 so that we can eliminate that third-party data processor for both of the primary use cases, the Copilot and the NLP user interaction model. We're targeting beta functionality in early 2024 for that type of feature. And with all of that said, obviously there are some risks associated with generative AI. We talked a little bit about that, or at least I touched on them, mentioned them yesterday in the introduction. And Mr. Glaue is going to elaborate a little bit more on what those risks and problems might be.
All right, thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
Well, how many of you are currently encountering or making use of or planning to use something that's AI related, large learning model related, large language model, sorry? So we have a few of you. Yeah, it's pretty fast and growing, isn't it? And you've probably heard a lot of horror stories already out there, right? Where you're putting in a lot of some people are putting in their sensitive content. They're then trying to get a process result, and they're trying to, cut to the draw and try to get things done quickly. But in the same time, what they're doing is that content is getting kind of exposed and being partaking or participating in that large language model that's being done that might be outside of your company. And so what we have is we have a sensitivity issue around that, right? And it's a concern that some teams are having. What I want to talk to you about is some of the risks, some of the difficulties that you're going to have in regards to that. And you're probably hearing a lot of these stories that there's some concern from a security perspective, especially related to your IP. But I'm going to tell you that there's a way that we can nip that in the bud right off the front. And I want to discuss that a little bit because there's some things that you can be doing what we call synthetic AI, all right, which is a way in which we can say, instead of your real data and making it anonymous, striking out, certain things that you might find sensitive, instead of taking that approach, taking more of a novel approach and saying, can I instead create and retain all the functionality, still be able to create and learn off of my real data, but yet create some sort of a synthetic data set that can then be used to train that large language model. Now, the value of something like that is that if you're doing that, your model, in and of its sense, doesn't have that proprietary, that sensitive data inside of the LLM there, okay? But yet, if you do it right, then all the functionality, all the things that you have gotten with your real data is now still there, but yet it's playing with data that's maybe not real, okay? And how are we doing on that presentation? Oh, still working on it? Okay. So, So what I want to do for you is I want to define what synthetic AI is and why it's important in concert or in complement as a complement to generative AI, and why you might want to consider that for your teams. Okay. And some of us are like jumping right in, and we're trying to get AI going as soon as possible within our organizations, and I can understand that. But at the same time, if we take some of these crucial early steps, then we never have to be considering, somebody's going to come in and reverse engineer. I can imagine that you might have somebody right now that might be coming into some of the AI stuff that they're seeing with ChatGPT, and then when they're doing that, they're asking all sorts of questions, but the certain aspect of the reason why they're asking the questions is because they want to learn actually a little bit more about what's inside of that model in the way that they're asking the questions, the way that they query. All right. So I'm going to talk about, good. So let's talk about how knowledge is changing in that context. Business problem of data versus privacy here, and this legacy anonymization approach versus synthetic data. Then some Q&A. So traditionally, what we look for here is we say knowledge and people. You can't have one without the other. I tell teams, I run a lot of our technical community of practice teams within Caterpillar from a support and a consultant perspective. And what we try to tell them is it's really about two things. It's really about the knowledge, and it's about the people. Because the knowledge that you have for today is one thing, right? But it's the knowledge for the future that's also important, and that's in the people and how you develop them into those senior technical positions from where they're at currently. Okay? So the second thing here is artificially now, what's starting to come into prominence is knowledge being focused or being centered on large learning or large language models, which would be more correct in saying that, to AI. And then the interaction now is people and the AI query aspect. It used to be where knowledge and people used to be more closely interacted, but now people are going to something more artificial to get whatever they need, and that imposes risks. Okay, it imposes risks because we don't know exactly where those sources are coming from many times. So these changes that are undergoing, it affects privacy. It does. And the data and the privacy match that we're talking about, and how we train models so that when you get to that point of use, that those models and everything that you have in it has better value, more trusted value. That's what we want to try to achieve there. So Wired.com says, as generative AI systems are put to work by big corporations and smaller startups, the cybersecurity industry is hoping that data will be kept personal, and whether personal or corporate, will be safe from attack. So the way that we feed these models and what information we feed them has impact into how it's going to be used later and how it's going to be consumed later. It has a lot of value there that we need to make sure that we're being careful about how we're training these models and what models that you make use of that's been trained. Because sometimes we might say, well, in order to cut the chase, I'm just going to use this other large learning model or large language model over here. Great. I'm going to then do some work. Well, we don't know whether or not it can be trusted. That trust element is very important. For knowledge aware, we talk about vitality. Okay, vitality is about the knowledge. It's about, there's 4 components to vitality within knowledge, right? You have one that's saying the life cycle, and the life cycle of knowledge for vitality is saying, depending on what it is that I'm intending this knowledge to be created for, it's within this range, within this realm, within this context. But yet somebody else using it outside of that context, maybe halfway around the world for some other reason, that's outside my purview of why I designed or why I put this knowledge out there. So it has a half-life to it, in the saying that my value for that kind of diminishes. Another one is actually called usage, which is very familiar. How much your knowledge is being used has value. Whether or not it's being used a lot or not being used a lot will also impact that vitality score. Third one is actually on nonconformance. So nonconformance is saying, well, I was expecting a value of 8, but you know what? I got a value of 10, or it says 10, but I'm going to put in a value of 4 anyways. And so there's a trust element when you do that. There's a bias, and there's 2 responses you can typically get. One would be that you could say that person just didn't know what they're doing, so it's a training opportunity for that individual. Or another one might be that, guess what, we're pushing the envelope on this design, on this solution. And so when I'm doing that and I'm pushing that, it may be something that we might want to take back and feed back to our authors, to our technical community teams to say, you might want to reevaluate this again because things are changing out there in the engineering and product design cycle. Okay. So you have, the other one is aging, or what we call sunset. So if you anticipate that it's used after it's supposed to be kind of like archived, and it's a year later or 2 years later and you're still using that, then that's not as expected. So all these 4 components actually create a vitality score. And that's important for knowledge perspective. But I wanted to also forward to you that there's this other idea about bias, that there's a people side of this as well. And the people side basically says that for bias, you know what? I'm going to do my own thing anyways. Or that knowledge, guess what? It came from Tim, and so therefore, because it came from Tim, I don't like him and I don't trust him, so I'm not going to use it. Does that ever happen in your organization? Even though it says it's sanctioned, it's authoritative, it's meant to be used for these purposes within your design flows, but yet it's not being used anyways because somebody doesn't like you or somebody doesn't trust that knowledge because it came from a source that I don't personally trust. That becomes an issue. So it's 2 things. It's vitality of the knowledge, but it's also the trust element. And so what we're talking about here is the trust element of that. So here we have data versus privacy. Today, or I would say in 2021, 1% of all the data, this is per Gartner, 1% of all the data being used to train LLMs is really around using synthetic data to do that. But by 2024, this is next year, it's going to grow to 60%. And the reason is because of this security aspect. Synthetic data is generated by supplying or applying a sampling technique to real-world data and creating simulation scenarios where models and processes interact to create a completely new set of data, not directly taken from the real world. And that synthetic data, why do we do that? From a knowledge perspective, we really want to have that real data, really, don't we? But the thing is if you don't think about the security and the sensitivity of your data up front and do something about it, you don't know what's going to happen later. Because these LLMs, I got a feeling, I'm a futurist, okay, so I've got a feeling that it's going to be leveraged, it's going to be shared. These things people are going to want it more and more. They're going to want to use this AI capability, and they're going to take that model and they're going to use it for some other area that you did not intend. And that's going to start impacting that vitality. It's going to start impacting that trust a little bit, okay? So it's just something to consider. So anonymization technology, what that basically is it's saying if I use real data, I'm going to try to mask certain sensitivities out of that data so that when I portray it out there, that when I do a prompt, like Josh said, NLP, and I'm doing a prompt and I'm adding that in, that sensitivity won't be exposed. Well, there's risks for that because we know that there's individuals that will go in there and they will seek that out. I mean, they're going to do whatever they can, and we've heard about prompt engineering, right? They're going to go in and they're going to surgically look through that model in a way that they ask the questions, and they're going to glean information. They're going to make some suggestions or some thoughts about what is actually being portrayed, what's actually in your model. And they're going to find out. They're going to find ways. They're going to get really smart and very interested about how can they get in there and get that information out of there that you're trying to block. So what we want to do is, I believe, we want to nib that in the bud right up front, and we want to figure out ways in which we can synthesize or make that information synthetic up front before it even gets into that model. But yet when we do the training, it still has all the same functionality, has all the same patterns, it has all that still ingrained in there. It's just the data that's part of it is not something that you need to be worried about. That's what I'm promoting. I'm just trying to get you that idea here up front. So we're talking about completely new data, not real data. Every single face that's in this picture is AI generated, okay? I mean, it's getting so sophisticated it looks real, and you don't know the difference. But can you imagine what that means? So for knowledge aware, why is this important? So large language models should be trained with synthetic, not real data, and this data to ensure that sensitive knowledge cannot be reverse engineered. We don't know how or where AI will be leveraged in the future. This AI thing is really growing like wildfire, and people are just gravitating towards it, and they're grabbing whatever they can. They're using it, and they don't, without any, almost to abandon. They're just doing that just because they're so excited about the whole technology and what it can do for us and how it might be able to help me or whatever. But we have to be very careful up front, I think, about how we train those models and how it subsists for that AI inquiry. So here I have on the very bottom here, I have AI learning models and your artificial intelligence application, okay? So when you query a large language model, the AI model inference generates a response. And through multiple queries, the model content begins to be exposed. Now LLMs, they're subsisting on their reasons for query may be shared in the future beyond the life cycle intention of that model. And so you might have some privacy sensitive data, and so we want to make sure that we instead do something different. That we take a synthetic data generator with deep learning algorithm behind there, and we train it on that privacy sensitive data. Okay, so we have a pseudo set of data, not the real data, and we put that into what our AI learning models or our large language models would be learning from. Okay, it's not learning from your real data, but something that's 99%, maybe 95% or whatever of what real data would have given it. Still retain all the patterns, the functionalities, and so forth. And so what this does is synthetic data for AI nullifies the risks found from legacy anonymization modeled learning techniques and still retains the full functionality for the most part for your AI instance, okay? So for my last comment here, it's just something to consider as an extra layer of precaution for your knowledge, because knowledge is important to our organizations. And when I look at knowledge, I don't look at just the knowledge itself. I always look at the people and how it interacts. That relationship between knowledge and people to me is very important, and I think it is to you and your teams as well. You can't have one without the other. And this will just try to help you to make sure that you're doing everything you can for your organizations to make sure that that sensitive data doesn't slip out somehow, okay? And with that, I'll leave it up for questions.
Just so everyone can hear. I haven't seen any come up on the app yet. I know you heard me. So let's open it up here and see if any folks, yes, we have one there.
Okay. So when you're building synthetic data like that and you have to pull out a sample of whatever private data set that you have, how do you ensure that you're not accidentally pulling out a sample that's biased towards one particular aspect of something? I guess how do you get a truly representative sample that you know is going to be representative that isn't going to be biased in some way that's going to cause issues down the line that will grow when you're synthesizing more data?
Yeah, so the question is related to how you train. The way that you're able to train with the synthetic data generator really is the key there. We don't really know how it's going to be used quite a lot. You can have questions that might be off the cuff that might be a little bit different than that. Honestly, it's really around how that synthetic data generator and how it's trained on that real-time data is really what matters. The ability to do that is really functional to the generator itself and how well it does the job. I guess that's about the best way I can describe it.
Okay, hopefully that helps. Other questions? Yes, we'll bring a mic to you. Brian's right here. Thanks.
So how are you intending to apply AI to Auros data that might be available? I mean, what might we be expecting in the future coming from Auros related to AI?
Well, I don't want to speak for Josh and Jeff and the team since I'm not an Auros guy, but what I would say is I would believe that they would start walking before they start running. And so I think what Josh described was something in the form of something like ChatGPT, where you can just query the model with some, with a prompt area, and you can actually ask the model, certain questions, get some responses back. I think that's at least what I would do early on when you're first trying to get started in how this might be effective. But I would imagine as a futurist thinking ahead about where that might go from there.
Even to do that, then would we be, because that would be proprietary inside, all that Auros is on our own internal servers, should we consider the synthetic data version? Or because we're inside the firewall and we don't ever intend for our AI model to go outside the firewall, maybe we can go right to our real data. We would want to, I think, use our real data and not synthetic data if we could.
Yeah, you would still, it's a good question, you would still use your real data in the consuming context of how you interact with AI. I'm not trying to dissuade from that. What I'm saying is when we train the model, I think we want to use something as synthetic data for the model training aspect, not from the use perspective aspect. The use perspective, we still want to use the real data, right? That's very important. In fact, we're going to still use the same protocols for security that we're using today for that in the use case perspective. What we're promoting here is this idea as we start looking at this and starting to create our own data sets and starting to get out there and push the idea about the synthetic data generator and how I might be able to do that. We just want to be thinking a little bit more about security up front as we train these models, because the models that really become the incidents that might get shared around outside the Auros application or wherever else, right, at some point. And so this might be more of a statement for more of Auros than it might be for you as a consumer or as a user of Auros. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Good question.
And just to follow up on what Tim was talking about from an application perspective, the engagement model right now that we're working on is similar to ChatGPT. So it would be where you could ask questions. Those questions, if they're about Auros content, the content would be provided from us. And if it's about General Motors best practices, then obviously it would be querying the information that's provided from you.
So it would be a separate product. Wouldn't be Auros and launch from inside of Auros. There's a little window with a little chat, and you can just type your question inside Auros. It would.
Yeah, I think the interaction model right now. Yeah, the interaction model right now is being worked out, so we don't have like the exact interaction model. From a commercial perspective, how it would be deployed, I think that's still to be determined as well.
Yeah, I would say the AI model inference activity that you're doing there, that could be, we could put that prompt inside of Auros, yes. It could be outside of Auros. The point is was it trained or targeting on, right? If it's targeted on that central part of Auros that, that their libraries, for instance, then that would be the thing, regardless of where the prompt comes from.
Well, what made me ask was Josh said we could point, you could ask a question, if it was about Auros, we could point to Auros. If it was about proprietary, you could keep it inside. That's what made me ask. I knew that the prompt would be inside Auros originally, but that's why I asked.
Yeah, the
No.
data set. It would be where the data set's provided from. So it wouldn't necessarily be like the individuals using the product pointing it to different things. That would be all worked into the actual engagement model. Yep.
We had another question back there behind you. Yeah.
All right, you can hear me.
Yes.
So I guess I have a question about the synthetic data generator. So is that a clone of your real data with some coding to then modify the sensitive data? I guess I'm not visualizing how that data is generated.
Yeah, so it's like the fake pictures I was showing you earlier, right? They look real, but it's not real. Or if your data, for instance, it might connect you that face to, well, I got that face, now I might be able to get your social security number, or I might be able to get some other contact information that you weren't ever planning on sharing, because there's ways to make those connections. You don't have to worry about that because it's a pseudo real. It's not real, but it's a pseudo aspect of that data let's say, for instance, it might be a series of numbers, but the numbers have changed, but yet it doesn't change the functionality of why those numbers are there. Okay, that sort of thing.
Is this still on? Okay. I still don't understand. How do you decide to create that model that looks real, right? So, for example, we have, let's say, codes at GM, we call UPCFNA, right? How would the synthetic model create something that is like it, but not the real thing, right? Like the social security number, right? Like we have a social security number. Is it just going to say, okay, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? And then it's going to try to train AI based on this fictitious number that matches what a social security number looks like, for example?
Well, it might randomize those numbers, yeah, but it'd still be looking at the functionality of what you're training it on and how it actually conducts itself. And then it would then anonymize or whatever the data that would be used in context of that, so it's not attached to a real person. It's not like the social security number. It'd be a different number, for instance, but yet the functionality of why I need that social security number and what it's being used for, maybe it's a banking transaction or whatever, would not be, the source data would not be your data, your personal data. It would be some pseudo-generated number, but yet the functionality of why it's being used, why it's being pulled would all be retained, so that it can be then used in some future application. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But then the next final follow-up question is, okay, but doesn't that synthetic data still match somebody in real life? Like, you're going to create a... No? Those people look pretty real on the picture.
Yeah, I know.
They could match a real person.
But you might need, for instance, for that application, you might need those real faces, right, in order to be able to invoke something, let's say, about that's facial recognition related. And so what it might do is you might have anonymous social security number data that might be associated with that face. And the functionality of how I do all that would still be retained, but the information that's used to train that large language model or whatever, it comes from that. It doesn't come from your information. So that if I'm then doing an AI query and I'm looking for something that's related to social security number, I won't inadvertently find different ways around it to actually get your number, you see, that we try to mask out in the real data. That's how we're doing it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. That's a good question. Very thought-provoking.
Yes, it is. There's a lot to this, for sure.
Yeah, I'm not saying I'm an expert in this area. I'm just saying that these are things to consider, right, as we think about AI. Let's think up front a little bit more about our knowledge and how important it is and the security of that knowledge. And yeah, that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, very well said. Any other questions? If not, we'll roll right on to the next session. Thank you both, Tim and Josh. Great stuff.